Okay, so maybe we can again, and yeah, to stick to the theme of convection and self-aggregation, we have Alison Wing from Florida State University who will be talking to us about tropical convective organization and its relevance in nature. Yeah, Alison, you can start.
Okay, thank you so much for inviting me to speak, and thank you guys all for being there late in the day, your time. I know you've already had a busy day of lectures and talks and discussions and everything. I'm happy to be here to talk with you a little bit about self-aggregation of convection and the relevance potentially of some of the idealized mechanisms that have been studied here for real convective organization in nature. And so I want to motivate this by thinking about what convection looks like in the tropics with some photographs that I've taken. This is from the OTREC field campaign in the East Pacific in August 2019. And so sometimes deep convection in the tropics is isolated or scattered, like in this image here, where you have these kind of, individual, intense sort of towers surrounded by blue skies and sort of subsiding air. But often it's not. Often it's clustered, like in this photograph from the International Space Station, this photograph of a mesoscale convective system from that same OTREC field campaign. So convection in Earth's atmosphere organizes on a variety of different spatiotemporal scales, including the mesoscale with features like squall lines and mesoscale convective systems, the synoptic scale with phenomena like tropical cyclones, or equatorial waves. This shows an example of an African easterly wave, or at the planetary scale with phenomena like the Madden-Julian oscillation or the Inter-Tropical Convergence Zone itself. And this organization can be driven by a variety of different mechanisms. So for example, we know that vertical wind shear, in particular interactions between vertical wind shear and cold pools, is an important mechanism for squall line development. We know that at the largest scales, convection is organized by sea surface temperature gradients, where deep convection tends to occur over the warmest SSTs and be suppressed over colder SSTs. And then we also know that convection can be associated with dynamical disturbances, such as the equatorial wave spectrum. And this organization of convection is not just interesting from the different spatial structures that it creates, but it also really matters for climate. And so this is the frequency of a regime, a cloud regime identified with convective organization. And even though this regime occurs only 5 to 6% of the time, it is able to contribute about half of all tropical total rainfall, as well as a significant fraction of cloudiness. And so that's what's shown on the left here from Tan et al. 2015. In this case, CR1 is the satellite identified cloud regime that is associated with organized deep convection. And as you can see, it's almost half of the total tropical rainfall. We also know that variability in the organizational state leads to variability in the surrounding larger scale environment. And so individual convective scenes that are more aggregated are drier on average, have fewer higher clouds, and thus have enhanced net cooling at the top of the atmosphere. So this is showing some results from considering monthly variations at the scale of the entire tropics in a metric for the degree of organization and the net top of atmosphere cooling. This is from observations. And as you can see, during months where we have relatively more aggregated convection, we have more top of the atmosphere cooling. So this suggests that variability in the degree of organization is important for both sort of tropical and global energy budgets, as well as the hydrological cycle. So the organization of convection in the tropics is ubiquitous. It's organized by many mechanisms. But the question I want to ask is, well, what if we don't have some of those other mechanisms? Can convection still organize in the absence of wind shear, SST gradients, large-scale dynamical disturbances, or other heterogeneities? And so in order to answer this question, we're going to consider radiative convective equilibrium as a framework. This is an idealization of the tropical atmosphere. It's a statistical equilibrium in which you have a balance between the net rate of cooling of the atmosphere and convective heating. So you have short radiation that's entering the atmosphere, is absorbed by gases in the atmosphere and clouds. Some of it's reflected by clouds, some of it eventually reaches the surface. The surface then cools by emitting long-wave radiation, some of which is reabsorbed by water vapor and clouds in the atmosphere, and then re-emitted. And then we also have our that balanced by our surface turbulent fluxes of latent and sensible heat. And then when you add water budget balance in, that evaporation from the latent heating is compensated by precipitation. So if we consider radioconvective equilibrium as the background state for a modeling framework, we can then examine what happens to the structure of convection. So in this animation, we're looking down on a like 700-kilometer domain in radioconvective equilibrium. The gray spiky things sticking out at you are clouds. It's a particular isosurface of cloud condensate. We're looking down on the top of the domain here. It's doubly periodic, and the color shading is showing the boundary layer humidity. So initially, that convection is sort of randomly distributed across the domain. It looks a bit like fireworks or popcorn popping on the pan. But we see now that there's a development of this dry patch that is devoid of convection. And that's the beginning of a process known as self-aggregation, where you have these feedback mechanisms that amplify moisture anomalies and get them to grow. And that suppresses convection in the dry regions. At the same time, the moist regions are getting moister. And so what happens is that as the convection is suppressed in the dry patch, it becomes more increasingly localized into, in this case, eventually a single cluster. This process is known as self-aggregation. It's the spontaneous transition from randomly distributed to organized convection, despite the fact that this simulation had totally homogeneous boundary conditions. So this sea surface temperature was fixed and uniform everywhere. It was initialized just with random noise in the boundary layer temperature field. There was no mean wind, no shear, no imposed vertical velocity. There was no rotation in the simulation, no land. Everything is the same everywhere. So there really is nothing to force the convection to be localized in this entire spot, except for these localized internal feedbacks between the convection and its environment. And this localization of convection, despite homogeneous boundary conditions, was first seen in Held et al. At 93, and there's been a number of reviews over recent years about this phenomena. So I want to give you a little bit of a history of the self-aggregation phenomena and the different types of model configurations that it has been seen in. So that first Held et al. Study that found this localization of convection used a two-dimensional cloud resolving model. So this is a figure from that paper where if you look here along the x dimension and time in that simulation, this is showing precipitation. Initially, the precipitation was distributed across the whole domain, and then eventually it was isolated first into two and then into just one single cluster. And there have been other studies that have investigated this in 2 dimensions as well. The first study to show this type of phenomena in 3-dimensional simulations was Tompkins and Craig in 1998, which looked at a small domain square 3-dimensional cloud resolving model shown here. And in that study, they also explored doing mechanism denial experiments in which different physical processes are turned off in the model to try to understand its impact. So in panel A on the left, this is water vapor that is being plotted. You have these alternating kind of moist and dry bands. In this simulation, they did have mean winds. And then in panel B, they made the surface fluxes insensitive to wind speed, which reduced the scale and degree of that variance. And then in panel C, they also turned off the radiative interactive radiation, which kind of broke a lot of that structure. Another seminal study of self-aggregation, which also used a small domain square 3-dimensional cloud resolving model, was that of Bretherton et al. 2005, which did a lot of work to really comprehensively characterize the phenomena, its sensitivity to different sort of parameters. And again, in this simulation, it took the form of one single intensely precipitating moist cluster surrounded by clear subsiding air. We've also explored other geometries, so you can also do an elongated channel three-dimensional model, such as this example here. This particular domain was 12,000 kilometers long by about 200 kilometers wide. And so now you have these multiple aggregated regions with these alternating moist, dry, moist, dry, moist, dry bands where the rainfall rising motion is confined to the moist bands. Now, these were all cloud-resolving models in which they're run at, generally kilometer scale resolution and explicitly representing clouds and convective motions. But self-aggregation has also been seen to occur in regional or global models with parameterized convection. So, for example, these are some GCMs run on the global sphere with something around 1 or 2 degree resolution and parameterizations, but still in a non-rotating RCE situation. And in that case, the convective aggregation can take the form of one giant sort of hemisphere filling cluster or multiple smaller clusters. And there also have been, in more recent years, simulations with global cloud resolving models, as shown here. This is with the NECAM model, where again, you have now these kind of multiple large-scale clusters of convection. Finally, all of these simulations were non-rotating simulations, so F is equal to 0, again, an approximation for the deep tropics. But if we consider radiant convective equilibrium on an F plane, then the convective aggregation takes the form of spontaneous tropical cyclogenesis, with, in this case, the scale and thus number of TCs that can fit in this so-called TC world controlled by the value of the Coriolis parameter that is set. So this is all to say that convective self-aggregation in these idealized simulations has been seen across a wide number of studies in a lot of different sort of models and model configurations. But all these studies, as I said, they use different models, they use different details in terms of what SST they used, what solar insolation, what resolution, etc. And that motivated an intercomparison project, our CEMIP, to standardize those things, standardize the domain size, parameter, key parameter choices, resolution, etc., and have a suite of models do the same simulations. And so this is an example of a result from that project. These are the cloud resolving models that participated in that project. In this case, they all ran channel simulations that were 6,000 kilometers long by 400 kilometers wide, again, doubly periodic. What you see on the left is a snapshot of outgoing, well, I guess it's a daily, no, it's an hourly average of outgoing long wave radiation from day 80 of the simulations. And on the right is column integrated water vapor. And what we see here is that basically nearly all of these models are aggregated in some way, in that they have these, spatially temporally coherent moist and dry bands where our clouds and rain are confined to the moist regions. There was one simulation, a particular version of the WARF GCM that did not exhibit any convective aggregation in these simulations, but otherwise all the rest did. But as you can see, there's a wide variety in the strength of that aggregation. So how strong, how different are the dry and the moist regions from each other in the scale and the structures. So there's a lot of rich variability and diversity in this ensemble. The RCMF ensemble also included general circulation models with parameterized convection, as well as global cloud resolving models on the sphere. And so this is what those simulations look like. In order to save computational expense, the global cloud resolving models were run on domains with reduced Earth radius. And so they're shown to scale here, but then kind of blown up. So you can actually see the structure of the convection here. And again, all of these simulations are aggregated, but with widely differing extents in the scale, stationarity, degree structures of the convection, right? So some of them have, kind of one single cluster, others have many, some of them have them organized kind of in a regular pattern, others are more sporadic. Okay, so one of the kind of distinguishing features, as I mentioned, of self-aggregation is that as it occurs and the simulation transitions from this sort of homogeneous state where the convection is just kind of random and thus the moisture is, on average the same everywhere across the domain, it transitions from that state into one where the moist regions get moister and the dry regions get drier. So you have this like increasing separation between the moist and dry regions, which is captured as an increase in the spatial variance of column integrated frozen moist static energy. So frozen moist static energy is given by this equation here. It's basically contribution from internal, potential, and latent energies with an adjustment with the ice term here to allow this quantity to be conserved under moist adiabatic displacements, including the freezing and melting of precipitation. And if you take the mass-weighted column integral of this quantity, that is not changed by convection. Convection is just transporting and moving moist static energy in the vertical, not changing its column integral. And we again see that there's a large increase over several orders of magnitude in this spatial variance with aggregation occurring. And that's seen in this plot on the right. This is an example from one particular model running a long channel configuration where we considered a variety of different simulations with different sea surface temperatures. And this is the kind of characteristic evolution. We have, again, this kind of greater than an order of magnitude increase in the spatial variance as the moist regions get moister and the dry regions get drier. And then it levels off into a sort of new equilibrium state that's aggregated. Now, as you notice here, they do end up at different states as a function of the different temperatures. This is basically just a result of Clausius-Clapeyron with the exponential increase in water vapor and thus moist static energy. With SST, at the warmer SSTs, the moist regions are relatively moister than the dry regions. So the variance it increases just from Clausius-Clapeyron with SST. Now, because we have this, dramatic increase in the moist static energy variance, that indicates that processes that are acting to increase this moist static energy variance are processes which are favoring self-aggregation, which means that we can maybe make progress on understanding the mechanisms of this phenomena, what is leading to the enhancement of those moisture and MSE anomalies, which then localizes convection, by considering a budget for the spatial variance of column integrated frozen moist static energy. And that's given by this equation here. H hat, again, is the column integrated frozen moist static energy. The primes here are anomalies from a horizontal mean. So in the case of these idealized simulations, we take an average over the entire domain, subtract that from each grid point, and then you have an anomaly from the mean value at each grid point. You then, of course, can subsequently, this budget is valid then for every single grid point, but you can subsequently then average each term over the whole domain. And each of the terms has to do with sources and sinks in column integrated moist static energy. So those include surface enthalpy fluxes at the bottom of the column, radiative flux convergences, so our column integrated, so the column flux convergence for shortwave and long wave, and then advection. So basically, it's really telling us, how does the moist static energy in the atmosphere itself vary? It's controlled just by the boundary fluxes because, again, we've integrated over the effects of convection. With regards to the radiation fluxes, again, we're taking the column flux convergence, which is the difference between, oh, it keeps going away, the difference between the net fluxes at the top of the atmosphere and the surface to say how much the atmosphere itself is heating or cooling due to radiation. There also is advection here expressed as the horizontal convergence of the column integrated flux of moist static energy in or out of the column. So each of the terms in this equation takes the form of an anomaly in one of these sources or sinks of the moist static energy times an anomaly in the moist static energy itself. And so if you have a process that is a excess source of moist static energy, it's acting to increase the moist static energy in an already moister, higher MSE region, then that's a positive feedback where you're going to increase the MSE anomaly and make those moist regions moister. And so if your anomalies are both positive in the same location, you get a positive feedback, a positive tendency on the growth of MSE variance. Conversely, if you have a process that's acting to decrease the moist static energy of a moist region, like say you have more radiative cooling in the moist region, that would tend to damp those MSE anomalies and then thus act as a negative feedback on aggregation and a negative tendency for the moist static energy variance. So you can diagnose all of these terms in a model simulation and look at their contribution over time. You can also scale them by the domain mean variance at each time to express them as a normalized growth rate. And that is what's shown in this figure here. This is for, again, one set of simulations in an elongated channel with a cloud resolving model. And the black line here is the total diabatic term. So that's the sum of the surface flux feedback, shortwave and long wave feedback. The surface flux feedback is shown in green. The long wave is shown in blue. The shortwave is shown in red. And then the advective feedback, which in this particular example is calculated as a residual, is in the pink line. And so what we see is that in the initial sort of development of aggregation in the first 20 days or so of this simulation, the two largest positive feedbacks are the surface flux and long wave feedback. The shortwave is also a positive contributor, but it's much smaller than the other two. So I want to now talk more about these different mechanisms one by one to really try to explain the physical processes going on in terms of what is leading to these feedbacks. So we'll start by talking about long wave. And there are both water vapor and cloud contributions to the long wave feedback. And I'll explain this kind of with a cartoon. So let's say that you imagine that you have some parts of the domain that are just randomly a little bit moister than other parts of the domain. And in those moist regions, you have more clouds. So that influences the flow of energy through the atmosphere. So in the dry regions, you would have strong long wave cooling at the tops of maybe some low clouds there. And then that can really escape to space effectively through that dry, transparent upper troposphere. Whereas in the moist parts of that domain, a lot of the long wave radiation emitted by the surface and low levels of the atmosphere will be absorbed by the clouds and water vapor in the atmosphere and then re-emitted at much colder temperatures, thus trapping a lot of that long wave radiation in the atmosphere. So when we're thinking about the cooling of the atmosphere itself, you would have large atmospheric long wave cooling in the dry region and small atmospheric long wave cooling in the moist region. So that means our moist regions are cooling less than the dry regions or anomalously have a source of moist static energy and anomalous heating. That would act as a positive feedback. And it usually is a positive feedback. It is possible for this to be a negative feedback, but usually it's a positive feedback. And there are, as I said, contributions from both water vapor and clouds, though typically the clouds have a larger influence on the spatial variability of the long wave heating than just the clear sky moisture effects do. So that kind of initial diabatic response to the variations in cloudiness and humidity due to the radiative heating can start to amplify those moisture anomalies. And as those grow, you can have further feedbacks that are more indirect involving the long wave. Because once you have spatial variability in radiative heating, that is going to drive circulations, and those circulations themselves then can transport moist static energy around. And so this is known as radiation circulation coupling. And in this schematic from Koppen and Bonny, 2015, they show especially that the enhanced low-level cooling associated with low clouds in the dry regions drives these shallow overturning circulations, which they term radiatively driven cold pools. Because they're shallow, so they have kind of inflow towards the moist regions in the boundary layer, and then sort of subsidence at sort of mid-levels and kind of outflow there. That means that these shallow circulations can actually help import moist static energy from the dry regions into the moist regions, and so thus contribute to moistening the moist regions and forcing the convection to aggregate outside of these dry, coldy areas. And so that's another important process for kind of accelerating the self-aggregation process once it gets kicked off. Now, there are some other mechanisms as well, including ones that are not necessarily directly captured by the moist static energy variance bunch feedback. This would be driven by long wave, but embedded inside that advective term. But there's other things that aren't explicitly captured as well, including some of the processes shown schematically here. One is known as the moisture memory feedback. And that's the idea that if of course, when we have convection occurring, there's lots of turbulent mixing or entrainment at the edges of the clouds, as indicated schematically here with these little green swirls. And that turbulent mixing or entrainment of environmental air into the cloud is less effective at reducing the buoyancy of the updrafts when the air that's being entrained is moist. And so having convection occur in an already moist environment further favors convection there. And that sort of feedback can kind of amplify all of, like, if you have these initial sort of, say, long wave force feedbacks to adjust the moisture distribution, these convective moisture memory feedbacks can kick in to amplify things even more. We also can have influences by cold pool interactions, shown schematically here with 3. And so if you have evaporation-driven cold pools, so as rain is falling into a subsaturated atmosphere, it can evaporate and cool and thus rapidly sink. Those evaporation-driven cold pools, as they reach the ground and expand outwards, they can trigger new updrafts via lifting at their edges, especially when multiple cold pools at sides collide. So at the cloud scale, cold pools can, and when they interact with each other, contribute to convective clustering sort of at smaller scales. But it's a bit of a double-edged sword because strong cold pools over larger scales can also impede organization by spatially homogenizing moisture. So depending on the scale you're interested in, that can kind of go either way. We also have influences related to variability in the surface enthalpy fluxes, in particular in relation to how wind speed affects those surface enthalpy fluxes. So if we again consider our kind of cartoon of moist versus dry regions, where we would tend to have a little bit more deep convection in the moist regions, our surface fluxes, if we consider the kind of classic bulk aerodynamic formula for them, they're controlled both by the air-sea enthalpy disequilibrium and by the surface wind speed. And so if we think first about the air-sea enthalpy disequilibrium, that will be influenced strongly by the boundary layer humidity. And so in the moist regions, you would have a smaller disequilibrium between the boundary layer and the sea surface below than in the dry regions. So on its own, that would tend to give us larger surface enthalpy fluxes from the ocean to the atmosphere in the dry region compared to the moist region. That would be a negative feedback, right? Because we're having an extra source of moist static energy in the dry regions where it's low. So that would damp that MSE anomaly. But in the moist regions, we also have more clouds and convection, which means we have more convective gustiness and stronger wind speeds near the surface. So that on its own would tend to enhance surface fluxes in the moist regions and suppress them in the dry regions. And so the wind speed and disequilibrium have sort of opposing influences on the surface fluxes. And early on in the simulation, typically the wind speed effect wins, and we overall have larger surface fluxes in the moist regions. And so this wind induced surface flux feedback can help convection aggregate initially as well. But later on, once you really start to kind of strengthen those moisture anomalies and start to dry out the boundary layer more, then the disequilibrium effect can dominate, and it can actually, the feedback can actually change sign to something that is opposing aggregation. So these are sort of the key mechanisms. And then I would say the ones that have been identified as most, these all can contribute, but the ones that have been identified as most critical across the literature are really the ones involving long wave, cloud interactions, and then the coupling of circulation with that. So we can see that by considering the same moist static energy variance budget across not just one simulation, but our ensemble of all the simulations from the RCMIP project in this really nice comprehensive analysis from Pope et al. 2023. There's a lot going on in this figure. Let me try to explain it to you. In these 3 panels here on the left, we have the total variant tendency. Then the next 3 is the long wave feedback, then the short wave feedback, surface flux feedback, and then the advection term. In all of these, the black symbol is the mean across all of the models. The triangles are the cloud resolving models, and the circles are the GCMs. The pink is just like one particular model, the Met Office model. For the radiative terms, the blue ones are the clear sky versions. And then they also average these terms over different stages of the simulation. So the filled symbols are during that initial growth phase, showing what processes are contributing to the convective aggregation. And then the open symbols are during the mature stage, saying what is acting to maintain the convective aggregation. So if we look first at the tendency term, it's positive during the growth stage, good. The variance is increasing with time, and it's near zero during the maintenance phase, so steady state. Focusing on the closed symbols for the growth stage, we see that really across all of models, the biggest contributor is the long wave feedback, and particular long wave cloud feedback, especially that associated with high clouds. The shortwave feedback also does tend to be a positive contribution, but is much, much smaller. The surface flux feedback is interesting. It's a positive feedback in most models, but not all. There are some where it's a negative feedback, even in the beginning, and this would likely be due to different boundary layer parameterizations in the simulations and relative contributions of wind and disequilibrium. The advective feedback is typically a negative feedback, though, again, it could still have positive feedback. This is the whole column integral, right? So the shallow circulation could still contribute even if the total column integral is a negative feedback. And then when we get to the growth stage, the open symbols, it's again really the long wave feedback with more contribution from the surface, the shortwave feedback, maintaining the aggregation against negative surface flux and advective feedbacks. So to kind of summarize this part of the talk on the idealized simulations of convective aggregation, studies agree that convection preferentially occurs in humid, high moistatic energy regions, and that as convection aggregates, our dry regions get drier and moist regions get moister, which increases the humidity and moistatic energy variance in the domain. I didn't show it here, but studies have also shown, and this multi-model ensemble agree, that self-aggregation affects the domain mean climate as well as climate feedbacks. In terms of the physical processes of self-aggregation, we find that feedbacks between the long wave radiation and clouds especially, but also water vapor, are essential both for triggering and maintaining self-aggregation. Surface flux feedbacks generally favor the development of aggregation, but aren't always essential. And then furthermore, the self-aggregate state exhibits strong hysteresis. So in these idealized simulations, once convection aggregates, it really stays that way. It's hard to kind of disaggregate it unless like something like mean wind shears develop spontaneously in a simulation or are imposed. But basically, self-aggregation is a very robust phenomenon in that it occurs across a wide range of models, all with different physics schemes, dynamical cores, parameterizations, etc. However, many things still remain uncertain. So for example, how does this phenomenon behave if we make the simulations a little bit less idealized and add in things like mean wind or vertical wind shear? What if we have an interactive surface? There's been some studies with this, and you can kind of have new modes of variability emerge. What if this is over a land surface instead of an ocean surface? I didn't talk about it here, but we also don't know what controls the spatial scale of aggregation. As you saw in the simulations I showed across different models, it's generally order 1,000 kilometers, but it can vary a lot from one model to the next or within different parameter regimes. What controls that? There are some theories and ideas, but I would say nothing is really fully accepted yet. We also don't know what controls the temperature dependence of self-aggregation. So in this radiative convective equilibrium model intercomparison project in that ensemble, simulations were done at 3 different mean sea surface temperatures. And I kid you not, like half the cloud resolving models had an increase in aggregation with warming, whereas half of them had a decrease in aggregation with warming. GCMs, on the other hand, tend to be more aggregated in a warmer environment. So we still don't really know what's going on there. So lots of kind of interesting things have been learned, and it's a really, fascinating sort of framework to kind of think about, in general, these different processes. But in the remaining time in my presentation, I want to kind of discuss this question of, well, does this matter, right? These were super idealized simulations, right? No mean wind, no shear, no variability in the surface temperature, no rotation. If we remember our definition of self-aggregation, it's the spontaneous clustering of convection in a homogeneous environment that's driven by these radiative convective feedbacks. The problem, of course, if we think about how this applies to the real world, is that the real world is not homogeneous, right? We have land, we have continents, we have variations in sea surface temperatures, we have a whole host of dynamical disturbances causing patterns of shear and rising and sinking motion and mean winds. We have rotation and variability in the strength of that rotation. So the real world looks really different than this idealized RCE environment, even though they do ultimately have to manage the same energy balance. So how could this matter, right? What are the possible applications of self-aggregation that we see in these idealized simulations to real world convective organization? So one idea is that you could have convection that's initially organized by other means, for example, shear cold pool interactions, that then is kind of amplified or helped to be maintained by these radiative convective feedbacks. So kind of the idea here is that if left to their own devices, like it's the only thing going on in these idealized simulations, these cloud radiative feedbacks can organize convection on their own. Even if there are other things going on, those feedbacks are still operating and they can still help convection organize or stay organized, even if they aren't the ultimate thing driving it. There's also the potential that those feedbacks could be an important driver for the Madden-Julian oscillation. They could contribute to mesoscale convective organization, especially under conditions of weak external forcing. So we know that in the tropics that we do sometimes have convective organization even in low shear environments. And these feedbacks could also contribute to tropical cyclone development. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about both the MJO and tropical cyclones. And so there have been some studies that have suggested that maybe we should consider the MJO as self-aggregation, but on an equatorial beta plane. And so there are some studies from observations and simulations alike that suggest that the MJO is a quote unquote moisture mode that is driven by cloud radiative interactions, which are the same feedbacks that are driving self-aggregation in idealized simulation. A moisture mode basically means that the evolution of moisture and convection is essential to the dynamics of the system. I'll note that this is not the only theory for MJO. There are other theories as well that don't rely on cloud radiative interactions, but this one is one that is getting kind of traction in the community. And in those studies, they find that, yeah, the cloud radiative interactions are kind of really the energy source, but surface flux feedbacks and moisture advection are what's contributing to the eastward propagation. So this is an example where a super parameterized GCM was used to perform rotating RCE simulations, and they had this fun, again, uniform SST, no continents, all that kind of stuff. And they had the spontaneous formation of something that kind of looks like an MJO, right? We have this kind of blob of moist static energy and convection that propagated east. And if you look at the moist static energy budget shown here, you can see that the long wave heating is in phase with the moist static energy, so that's acting to amplify those anomalies. We then have the MSE tendency, and that the latent heating from the surface fluxes and horizontal and to some extent vertical advection are in phase with the tendency, contributing thus to the propagation. There also have been near global cloud permitting rotating RC simulations performed, where they then did mechanism denial experiments where they removed different processes. So this is showing, I think, also moist static energy as a Hofmahler diagram. And so in the control simulation, you have these slow eastward propagating anomalies that are kind of MJO-like. If you homogenize the surface fluxes, you still have these large scale anomalies, but they don't propagate at all. And if we homogenize the radiation shown here on the right, you still have propagation and you still have some anomalies, but they're a lot weaker than in the control simulation. So these are idealized simulations, but cloud radiated feeding has also been shown to be important to the MJO in observations and in comprehensive GCM simulations. And so this is an example from a realistic comprehensive GCM. My video went, where it's showing the spectrum, wave number frequency spectrum of variability, kind of a Wheeler-Collattis type diagram. And this sort of blob at positive zonal wave numbers and low frequencies, that's the MJO. And they did two sets of simulations here, a control simulation on the top, and then a simulation in which cloud radiative interactions were turned off, and the difference between them is shown on the bottom. And basically, the MJO activity is weakened significantly when those cloud radiation interactions are turned off, suggesting that those interactions are important for the MJO. If you also look in reanalysis, observational-based studies of the MJO and do a moisture budget or MSE budget, whoa, went way back, and look at the contributions, in this case, to maintenance in the column integrated moisture anomalies, we see that the radiative term shown here expresses sort of the vertical moisture advection from specifically anomalous cloud radiative heating is a leading term in the maintenance of these MJO moisture anomalies. So this suggests that, maybe one application of the idea of self-aggregation is in the MJO, though, this is still obviously a very active area of research with a variety of different theories for the MJO proposed. So going back to my list here, the next thing I want to talk about is tropical cyclones. And there's growing evidence that cloud radiative interactions are important for tropical cyclones in a variety of different ways. So to demonstrate this, this is a radar image of using the CloudSat radar, which is was a satellite-based radar. It's a cross-section through Typhoon Choiwan from 2009. The reflectivity is basically showing where the clouds are. And then I've overlaid these black arrows to give you a sense of what the circulation of the tropical cyclone looks like. In this case, we got very lucky that the satellite went right over the eye of this typhoon. So again, we have sort of this deep in, up, out circulation with then kind of the primary circulation twirling around near the surface in a tropical cyclone. So where you have this thicker, more heavily laden clouds, more heavily laden with water in the inner core, that will lead to greater sort of radiative heating or anomalous radiative heating compared to the outer regions where there's less cloud water. So the fact that the radiative heating rate depends on clouds and water vapor. The clouds and water vapors, their spatial structure is shaped by the circulation of the tropical cyclone. So you have differences in clouds that leads to differences in radiative heating. That drives circulations, which can kind of support the tropical cyclone's secondary circulation and lead to the potential for radiative feedbacks on TCs. And there's lots of studies that kind of have suggested that things from TC structure to genesis to size to intensification rate all depend on having this spatially varying interaction. And so just to kind of summarize two of the studies that I've been involved in, we find both in idealized and realistic simulations that tropical cyclone formation is significantly delayed without radiative feedbacks. And so let me just pull this all up. The top simulation is an idealized simulation. So in a cloud resolving model, not of a particular TC, but an imaginary one where it's initialized from a moist bubble. The control simulation is in black, and then we have a bunch of other simulations where we turn the cloud radiative interactions off in various different ways. And basically, as you can see, look at the evolution of the wind speed. When we remove those radiative feedbacks, it takes at least twice as long for the tropical cyclone to form. Furthermore, once it does form, the intensification rate is lower. The bottom panel is showing similar simulations, but for case study simulations with WRF of Hurricane Maria from 2017. And the black is the control simulation, and then the colors are where we remove the cloud radiative effects at various different times. Now, the biggest influence is at the early stages. So if you remove the cloud radiative interactions before the storm has really started to develop, then we prevent development entirely within the length of the simulation. But even if we already let it get to close to hurricane strength and remove the cloud radiative interactions, then it still slows intensification. So these simulations across this hierarchy of models suggest that these radiant interactions, they're not necessary for tropical cyclone development, but they definitely help, right? Because the TC can still form and intensify without them, but it forms more slowly and it intensifies more slowly. And this again has to do with the spatial variability in the radiative heating. So in our control simulation shown here, where time is going down on the y-axis from day 1 through day 5, the color shading in the background is showing the anomaly of long wave radiative heating rate. And then the cyan is showing a contour of ice condensate, and the green is showing a contour of liquid condensate, just to give you an idea of where the clouds are. Without cloud radiative effects, we really get rid of that variability. I don't know if this looks washed out on your projector screen, but trust me, there's not much interesting to see. In association with really removing that spatial variability in the radiative heating rate, that significantly weakens the overturning circulation that develops. And so here the color shading is radial wind, where blue is inward towards the center of the tropical cyclone, red is outwards, and then the black contour is vertical motion. So in the simulations with zero cloud radiative effects, that the development of that overturning circulation is delayed and it's much weaker. And in association with that, we also keep the inner core drier longer. So without cloud radiative effects, it takes much longer for the inner core to saturate and the TC to really form. Now, this has also been examined in observations as well. And so several different studies have looked at this. The top is showing a result from Wu et al. 2021, which this figure is showing radiative anomalies or radiative heating at the top of atmosphere from series observations. They also looked at cloud set observations, and they found that intensifying TCs, which are the ones in the middle panel here, have greater radiative heating within the TC area, and thus a greater spatial variance and cloud radiative effects than the weakening ones. And this is the difference between the two. So intensifying TCs have greater radiative heating rate in the inner core than the weakening ones. And then Lee and Wing further examined this with CloudSat-derived long-wave feedback using the Moissac energy variance budget. Here it's shown as a function of radius and compositive over storms with different intensification rates, where red is rapid intensification, orange is fast, green is slow, and blue are ones that are not intensifying at all. And so basically the rapidly intensifying TCs have the greatest long-wave feedback in the inner core. Lee and Wing also found that that feedback is stronger in stronger storms. And then work and review by one of my students has looked at the ratio between the long-wave feedback and the surface flux feedback derived from a combination of dropsons in series, and found that, you know, while the surface flux feedback is larger than the long-wave feedback in TCs, the long-wave feedback is relatively most important, closest to the magnitude of the surface flux feedback in the weaker storms. And then finally, from observations, Lee et al. Also looked at the circulation response to the CloudSat-derived radiative heating anomalies using the Sawyer-Leeson model to calculate the kind of axisymmetric response to imposed heating in this balanced initial vortex. That's what's shown here. The red is the long-wave heating, and then the contours are the radiatively driven circulation. The further thing that he did was he separated out the contributions into the circulation driven by variability in radiation from ice and liquid, or just liquid. And it's really the ice clouds that are dominating here. That's what gives us most of our spatial variability in radiative heating and drives this deep overturning circulation, which contributes or enhances the tropical cyclone's overall circulation. So with that, I will conclude. And just to kind of summarize, overall, interactions between clouds, radiation, surface fluxes, and circulation can drive convection to self-aggregate into spatially and temporally coherent clusters, despite totally homogeneous boundary conditions and forcing. Now, again, if they're left to their own devices in the homogeneous RC environment, that's enough to give you self-aggregation. In the real world, there are other things going on, but those same feedbacks seem to help amplify phenomena like the tropical cyclone and the MJO. Now, there's still a lot we don't know, especially with respect to the manifestation in the real atmosphere, but it's kind of a provocative idea. You know, TC genesis is a longstanding problem. MJO is something we've always struggled to understand. And so it suggests that many of these longstanding problems in tropical dynamics might be solved by putting further emphasis on these kind of interactions between radiation and convection. And I'll finally note that one of the other possible applications of this to the real world, do these cloud-radiated feedbacks contribute to mesoscale convective systems, maybe in weak forcing situations? That was the target of the Orchestra Piccolo field campaign from 2024. And we're still deep in the analysis phase there, but our initial results suggest that it's probably limited at that smaller scale MCSs, but at larger scales, kind of greater than 700 kilometers, that's when these cloud radiative feedbacks really start to matter in nature. So with that, I'll end, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Alison. And do we have any questions?
Thank you so much for that talk. I have a pretty basic question. I was wondering if topography or orography has been investigated as something that is important for like the onset of self-aggregation, and not in like a realistic model, but maybe in like an idealized simulation itself.
That's a good question. Certainly in the real world, topography is really important for the onset of convection. In terms of this idealized self-aggregation process, I'm not aware of any studies that have looked at topography in an idealized setting. There have been some studies that have looked at self-aggregation over a land surface, in which kind of soil moisture feedbacks can contribute to the land kind of convective aggregation, but those studies were with a flat surface. There also have been studies where you kind of have fake land by having a kind of ocean mixed layer that is shallow and can kind of respond rapidly. But yeah, I think, you know, kind of gradually stepping up the hierarchy to add in some idealized topography would be an interesting next step for that. I suspect that that would kind of provide a sort of fixed location for kind of forcing convection relative to that topography, though it also would depend on if you imposed a mean wind in the simulation or if you just let circulations develop spontaneously. But that would be a cool idea to investigate.
Thank you.
Hi, nice talk. I'm just wondering, have you come across residual terms in your variance moist-static energy budget or any other budgets?
So it's really hard to close the moist static energy budget if you're using sort of just model output and calculating it offline. The results that I showed, I was diagnosing those terms at every time step in the model as it was running. And if you do that in a model that does a good job with conserving energy, you can close it. And so I think the result I showed, it was calculated the advection term itself as a residual, but in subsequent work, I have diagnosed the advection term explicitly in the model as it was running, and then, you know, could calculate a true residual in the budget, and it was very small. But if you're doing it with, say, you know, reanalysis output or things like that, your residual can be pretty big, because anytime the kind of native model grid data is interpolated onto, say, a standard lat long grid or more infrequent pressure levels, you lose accuracy there with the interpolation. And then if you're trying to compute the advection term yourself, you almost certainly are not going to calculate those gradients in the same way that they are calculated in the advection scheme in the model's dynamical core. So yeah, it's kind of tricky to close offline, but if you do it online in the model as it's running, then it's possible.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Alison. This is Vishal from IIT Bombay. Very nice talk. I was wondering, considering that there is RC MEPs have happened and they have had large AD simulations, cloud resolving models, and climate models. I see that as multiple length scales of domains. Also processes at many different temporal scales. So I was wondering if some invariant properties have emerged across all of these simulations for convective aggregation states that we could kind of synthesize out of this MIP.
Yeah. So, I mean, one thing that we see with regards to scale is that this phenomena only occurs in domains that are sufficiently large. And so it does seem to have some intrinsic length scale, and you need to kind of simulate it at scales larger than that for it to be realized in the simulation. The challenge is that a lot of the different models, even once they do aggregate, exhibit different scales of aggregation, likely because that scale is dependent on, some of these different physical processes. So there have been some studies that have looked at a kind of spatial budget for self-aggregation and looked at how these different feedback processes either contribute to increasing the scale of the moist regions or decreasing it. And so that kind of provides useful information. But even, despite those differences in the ultimate scales that are emerging and whatnot, the cloud radiative feedback still always kind of emerge as the thing that is most important for this large scale aggregation. As I mentioned before, if you're considering more cloud scale kind of aggregation, there the cold pools can be more important. So I think there actually are different modes and mechanisms depending on the scale of organization that you're considering.
Converge on to the fact that ultimate state is stable, one, and that you have convection which is axisymmetric in them of some sort. I thought these two came out for me. Maybe this list is incomplete.
Yeah, no, it is very stable. There's a lot of hysteresis. Once it gets aggregated, it kind of locks in, and it's hard to break that. So that's very true. The axisymmetry of it depends a little bit. Yeah. So if you have like a very large square domain or a spherical domain, they do tend to be circular clusters. And it's been some work that suggested that basically, I mean, that is just kind of, minimizing basically the boundary, I guess, between the moist and the dry regions. In these elongated channels, they're more like bands. Sometimes in GCMs on the sphere, you can have more squall line looking features too that are developing spontaneously. But yeah, generally some sort of, circular-ish cluster, if the domain permits it, is something that emerges. And as I said, at the large scales, the importance of the cloud radiative interactions is sort of universal as well.
Yeah, thanks, Alison.
Do we have any other questions? Maybe I can ask a final one. From your slides of the effect of cloud radiative effects on tropical cyclones, so there was this figure of radial inflow and outflow in the, I think, XZ plane. And we see that the effect of cloud is much stronger in the boundary layer than in the outward flow in the upper troposphere. Do we know?
Are you talking about?
Yeah.
Are you talking about this plot or this one?
The previous one.
This one.
Yeah.
Yeah. So so the circulation itself as a tropical cyclone forms, the inflow is confined to the boundary layer, whereas the outflow occurs over a wider layer, kind of in the upper troposphere. When you remove clouds, both the circulation overall weakens. The inflow weakens, the outflow weakens, the ascent weakens. You're suggesting it looks like it weakens more in the boundary layer than it does in the outflow layer. I think, yeah, it'd be more, it's hard to judge that from the color scale, I think. Both definitely weaken, but they may have been different magnitudes to start with. And so relative to the initial circulation, I'm not sure if you can say whether you have that asymmetry or not. But I think it'd probably be better to look at, for example, like I did here, calculate a stream function and look at, the magnitude of that stream function and how that decreases as you kind of get rid of the clouds. But it's possible that, because this circulation structure, so the vertical profile of the radiatively induced circulation depends on the vertical profile of the radiative heating. And so if you look back at what those look like, in the control simulation, you have the strongest sort of anomalous heating sort of in the upper troposphere, right under, like at the base of the high clouds. But then you have warming kind of throughout the lower troposphere and then cooling atop. So yeah, differences in kind of the placement of that and its magnitudes and kind of how that changes when you remove the clouds could contribute to, vertical structure in that circulation response as well.
Okay, yeah, thanks. Michaela has a question. I think we can take another one.
Hi, Ali. This is Michela Biasutti. A question about what happens if you have a diurnal cycle? Are the strength of the feedbacks and the relative importance the same, or how does that work? I'm assuming maybe for some of the simulation there was no diurnal cycle, but maybe at least the ones with land had it. So if you could comment on that, I would be lovely.
Yeah, so in the RC simulations, there was no diurnal cycle. I have done other, standard RC simulations with a diurnal cycle. With fixed sea surface temperature, the diurnal cycle doesn't really have a big effect on things. Like there is some variability in kind of the atmospheric absorption, but it's not a huge effect. And so you see fluctuations in the feedbacks. Of course, the shortwave feedback turns on and off, but it's a smaller contributor overall. There also are some variations in the long-wave feedback, but it didn't, the presence of the diurnal cycle or absence of it didn't seem to affect the overall evolution of aggregation. It didn't change the time scale of it or the strength or anything like that. And that was actually true for tropical cyclones as well, though we do know the diurnal cycle affects other aspects of tropical cyclone structure. I think that, with an interactive surface, especially over land, as you indicated, there are opportunities for the diurnal cycle to have a bigger influence. And there have been some studies that have looked at, for tropical cyclones, there is variability in then this radiatively induced circulation that kind of changes its orientation relative to the TC with the diurnal cycle. So, if probably real world organization where things are evolving, over shorter time periods and you're not locked into the state where aggregation exists for 50 days, have more opportunities for the diurnal cycle to matter. It's a little bit tricky to study with some of our observations of, a lot of satellites are in, sun synchronous orbits. Other sorts of sampling are not necessarily even across the diurnal cycle, but we're starting to look at a little bit with the orchestra piccolo observations.
Yeah, maybe we should thank Alison one more time. And thanks, Alison.
Thank you so much for having me. Enjoy the rest of your workshop.